In the video I made recently about defense, there were a lot of people bringing up how good lucky Reforges are, which give 4% crit chance instead of 4% damage. The argument is that they scale better than Menacing Reforges. While Menacing bonuses are additive with each other, applying off the same base number, lucky Reforges stack multiplicatively, doubling your damage after being increased for damage bonuses. That is true. In a vacuum, having equal amounts of crit chance and damage boosts is better than having a lot of either one individually, because they're additive with themselves and multiplicative with each other, and since it's much harder to get critical chance increases than damage increases, it makes more sense to reforge to lucky. It's not that simple though. I did say in a vacuum, shorthand for saying I'm ignoring problems to make it simpler. Reforging to lucky can actually be noticeably worse in some situations. Some background info first. A critical hit in Terraria doubles your final damage that you would deal. The damage calculating process is that you take the raw damage of your weapon, adjust it for any damage bonuses, reduce it for enemy defense, and then double it if it's a critical hit. I usually treat crit chance and damage as identical. I'll say things like the hollowed helmet gives 20% damage because it gives 10% damage and 10% crit chance. It's a simplification, but one that's generally accurate. Anything that deals summon damage, whether it's a whip, minion, or mount, cannot deal critical hits. Lucky Reforges and any other crit chance boosts will never be beneficial to a summoner. The one exception is that the Brain of Confusion's 10% crit chance buff after dodging an attack also has a hidden 10% summon damage increase. There are a few items that can give your minions a fixed chance to deal crits. Even if you have these items, additional crit boosts will not help. Like I said, the chance is fixed. Almost every weapon has a 4% crit chance inherently. These are the exceptions. With the best Reforge on your weapon, you'll get a 5% increase to crit chance alongside a 15% damage boost. I'm going to assume every weapon in this video has a 9% crit chance to start with because of that. There are only 3 buffs that will affect your crit chance: a Rage Potion, Food, and Ale. A Rage Potion is 10%, Food is 2 to 4%, and Ale is 2% for melee only. So, a character who is playing casually will likely have a baseline 12% crit chance with a 7.5% damage boost, while someone optimizing hard will have a baseline 22% crit chance, with a 17.5% damage boost as Ranger, 37.5% as Mage, and 27.5% as melee. As we can see, before taking armor and accessories into account, our crit chance starts out better than our additive damage boosts, with magic power potions and Ale giving Mage and melee slightly better damage boosts. In a perfect world, we would want the two to be equal for maximum damage. To show why this is, if we had plus 100% worth of bonuses to split up, putting all of it into damage would increase our DPS by 100%. Putting all of it into crit chance would guarantee each attack as a critical hit, which deals double damage, increasing our DPS by 100%. However, if we put 50% into crit chance and 50% into damage, we see our DPS increase by 125%. This is because of the multiplicative scaling I mentioned earlier. Let's look at a few different builds across the game. I'm not going to bother looking at defensive builds because I just spent an entire video talking about those. This is assuming you want to reforge for more damage. The question is, do lucky reforges provide more value than menacing, and are they therefore a good choice, since the conclusion of the defense video was that menacing was not very good? And now we need to wake up from the theoretically perfect dreamland. There is one glaring flaw in crit builds. Defense is twice as effective against critical hits because it applies before the damage doubles. Let's say you've got a 50% damage boost and 9% crit chance already and have the choice between reforging to lucky or menacing. These are pretty reasonable early hard mode numbers. You deal 40 damage with your attack against an enemy with 0 defense. Before reforges, your average damage per hit is 65. Well, the menacing build will bring you up to an average of 78 damage per hit. The lucky build will bring you to 82. That's a 26% damage increase instead of a 20% one. It's a fair bit better, much closer to what you're actually expecting to receive. But let's assume you're attacking something that actually has defense. Spasmatism Phase 2 has 28, meaning each attack does 14 less damage per hit. The menacing build will average to 62 damage per hit. The lucky build reaches 63. That is basically the same number. If the enemy has high defense, like Duke Fishron's first phase, which has 50, and you might do in early hard mode, the menacing build holds strong at 50 damage per hit on average. The lucky build actually falls behind and becomes less effective, reaching 48. This is just one example, but it's clear that defense has a disproportionately higher effect on crit builds. If we assume everything has 0 defense, we're going to be unrealistic about what lucky is actually achieving. Late pre-hard mode, a ranger optimizing their damage on a drunk seed could have a 32.5% damage buff and a 32% crit chance, and they'll likely have a shark tooth necklace to ignore defense. I'll say the build has shark tooth and stinger necklaces, and say you're attacking the eyes to ignore the wall's defense entirely to make calculations simpler. This is quite literally the exact same number. Since our starting crit and damage are practically identical, you get the same returns out of focusing on one or the other. You'd get slightly better damage out of mixing the two, but it's 86.4, which is less than 1 damage. You might notice some weird math and number rounding here. That's because I'm done simplifying. To explain, your weapon's Reforge applies multiplicatively with other damage boosts, which is why we're starting at 34 and it's not included in the damage section. We can verify this is true by checking the math with the in-game number. We round to an integer at every step. The Reforge actually adjusts the shown number in-game to reflect this. While it is a 15% damage boost, it rounds down to 34, which is only a 13% improvement. Your Reforge won't affect your ammo's damage, so that's calculated separately, rounded down, and added in, but it will affect the crit chance because crit chance is based off the weapon, not the ammo. Damage bonuses also always round down. I checked this by testing how long it takes to buff a flare, which has 1 base damage to 2 damage. You have to have 100% damage bonuses. It will never round up. Because we're dealing with average numbers, I kept the final values rounded to the nearest tenth. So, not a very impressive showing for Lucky. Let's say you're not optimizing for damage. You've got a food buff, your armor, and your reforges. That's it. No Wrath or Rage Potion, no Sharktooth necklaces. 22.5% damage, 22% crit, and the eyes have 6 defense. It should be pretty obvious from when I said 22% damage and 22% crit. It's the same story again, except now we have defense, which means Menacing has an edge, but it's a 1 damage difference. There is no reason to split hairs over Lucky and Menacing here. They are functionally identical. So that's pre-hard mode. What about late game? Let's look at a late game Ranger against the Empress of Light's second phase. We've got double scopes, Destroyer Emblem, Ranger Emblem, Avenger Emblem, Celestial Shell, and Magic Quiver, and we're on a Shrimpy Truffle in the rain. That takes us to a whopping 80% crit chance and 122% damage. Plus, the Shroomite headpiece has a multiplicative damage effect on our weapon, as does the Archery Potion. We actually can't even fully benefit from a Lucky build, so we'll be using 5 Lucky and 2 Menacing. And that's a 0.5% difference. They are functionally identical, no difference in your DPS whatsoever. Okay, what about a non-optimized build? Let's say Shroomite Armor and a Ranger Emblem. Pretty bare bones, but I think a casual player would feasibly have something like this. Lucky is worse here, considerably. The high defense of the Empress is really damaging Lucky's potential, and we already have an innately good crit chance. Even a mixed build is worse than pure Menacing. Now, Ranger does have the least use for more crit chance buffs. It's got multiplicative scaling baked in before defense and high crit chance through armor and accessories. Let's check melee, because mage is a massive headache with Spectre Armor set bonus. If you're using Beetle Armor, melee has quite bad crit chance. An optimized player might be using Beetle Armor, Destroyer Emblem, Warrior Emblem, Mechanical Glove, Fire Gauntlet, Celestial Shell, Avenger Emblem, and Eye of the Golem on a Shrimpy Truffle. Melee also has the Sharpening Station, reducing the Empress's defense to 48. Because this build has a massive number of additive damage boosts and far fewer crit chance boosts, Lucky has a better impact here. Being able to reduce some defense also helps. This is the best impact I saw Lucky have, and while it is good, it's also only 7% better and still well below 28% relative increase. If we look at a late game melee build that uses armor mixing, the difference is much smaller, very reminiscent of the optimized Ranger build with less than a 2% difference between the two. This build has much higher crit chance before accessory reforges, so Lucky is much less impactful. The difference is there, but barely. If we check in average melee build, let's say Beetle Armor, Warrior Emblem, and 1 Glove, that's pretty good. The build has low crit chance and high damage at first, so Lucky goes a long way. As we've seen, Lucky is most beneficial when a build has a large number of damage buffs and a much smaller number of crit buffs. Remember, they might be multiplicative with each other, but crit chance stacks additively with itself. When you already have good crit buffs from elsewhere, Lucky ranges from 1 to 2% better to 8% worse, while the highest benefit we saw was 7%. In a perfect world without defense, you want to have your crit chance buffs and damage buffs at the same level, but it really doesn't matter, especially since your effectiveness will vary depending on your armor and you're not going to reforge your accessories for every boss. Sure, for melee it's great with Beetle Armor, but not with Mithril Armor. Really, just get whichever one shows up first. Of course, this entire video has been talking about average DPS. Lucky is random, you'll have more noticeable highs and lows. Over the span of a boss fight, when you're hitting hundreds of times, you'll average out to the numbers from earlier. Against regular enemies, Lucky has one significant edge. Let's say you're attacking a cave bat with a weapon that deals 30 damage. The bat has 48 HP. A 24% damage buff will only bring you up to 37 damage. Menacing will never affect the number of hits to kill that bat. Regardless of whether it's a minimum or maximum damage roll, it'll die in 2 hits. Lucky builds give you a better chance to kill in 1 hit instead of 2. If you don't crit, it's the same number of hits as Menacing. If you do crit, it's 1 fewer hit. And the Menacing build can crit off of the base numbers, but Lucky increases the odds. Because of that, Lucky builds are often better for killing normal enemies. Not always, because sometimes that 24% damage can bring you high enough to kill in 1 fewer hit, but it is an advantage of crit builds. You'll often have better time to kill on small enemies. On the other hand, critical hits deal heavily increased knockback, which can make it more difficult to kill enemies that don't die in 1 hit. There's also another major issue with crit builds though. Do you summon minions? Just in general, you find a staff, you use it. If you're summoning any minions, just summoning them, even if you're not a summoner, Lucky won't benefit them at all. Menacing will. Summoning minions is kinda just free damage. You can get up to 3 of them with no opportunity cost, and that's a 28% damage buff you're missing out on for them by using Lucky. In hard mode, mixed builds that use some minions are usually pretty good because Old One's army armors provide huge summon damage bonuses. Lucky is gonna lose the tiny edge it has even if it was better. It's really just off-brand Menacing. I appreciate the number of people that insisted I ignored Lucky in the defense video because it was so powerful it would have made warding look bad, instead of the more obvious answer, it's not really better than Menacing. It still scales additively with itself. In the kill time tests I ran in that video, we're using a 3-4 split of Menacing and Lucky. It looks good on paper, but it gets bodied by defense. It's perfectly fine to use Menacing and Lucky Reforges, I do sometimes, but don't delude yourself into thinking that warding Reforges are bad because of that. All it takes to justify it is to say, I don't like it, it's more fun for me to play the game like this. Also, I saw this come up a lot, but not getting hit is not the best way to deal damage. Just don't get hit is a worse strategy for DPS. You don't lose DPS for getting hit, only for dying. It's not like Monster Hunter or Dark Souls where you flinch and can't attack when you get hit, and even in those games, the Rocksteady Mantle and High Poise are really good, because they let you sit there and attack without being interrupted. You don't even lose DPS for healing in Terraria, whereas in other games you have to stop attacking to heal. There's no downside to taking damage as long as you don't die from it. It makes no difference whether you end a fight with 1 HP or 500, or whether a fight takes 1 minute or 100 minutes. If you're alive and the boss is dead, that's it, you won. If getting hit lets you deal damage better than dodging the attack and you won't die from it, then get hit. Your HP isn't a measure of how good you are at the fight, it's a resource pool. You can use it as a buffer to avoid dying when you make a mistake or get bad RNG, or you can expend it to play more aggressively, put yourself in dangerous situations, and deal better damage. Ending a fight 1 hit from death just means you fully utilized your available resources, that resource being your health.